Hi, I'm Alex Dalziel. Welcome to Inside Policy Talks. I'm a senior fellow and the National Security Project lead here at the Institute. Today we're going to continue our conversation about national security and the priorities that are affecting Canada. I'm going to turn the conversation today towards financial crime, and I'm joined by Professor Christian Leuprecht, who's also a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who's a professor of political science at Queen's University and the Royal Military College, and is one of Canada's leading experts on an array of national security issues. He has just co-edited a book called Dirty Money, Financial Crime in Canada, and he's happily given us some time to join us today and speak about this. Christian, welcome to Inside Policy Talks.
Thanks, Alex. Great to be here.
Great to have you. So why don't we dive right in? So to start, financial crime, as you say in the book, doesn't always get the same attention that many other issues, drug trafficking, terrorism, illegal migration, get. I think and you also point to the need for a new language to talk about this. I'm not sure what most people think of when they think financial crime. So what are you talking about? What's your definition, and how would you describe financial crime?
Well, I think first the challenge is that most people don't understand it because it's not visible, and most people perceive it as a victimless crime. And of course, it turns out if you look on our streets, everything from the fentanyl crisis to the cost of living, there are significant and broad financial crime dimensions that are driving many of the challenges where many of the public policy approaches are trying to deal with the effects sort of that we can see in a daily basis, rather than the broader underlying symptoms that are driving these concerns that we have. Everything about our sort of the well-being of the people we see in our streets, and sort of the overall public safety challenges, for instance, that poses. And the challenge it poses to our international interests. So I always like to talk about financial and economic crime. For the sake of simplicity, we shorten the title of the book. But really here we're talking, traditionally, financial crime, people think about money laundering. And when they talk about money laundering, they tend to talk about a precursor crime of some sort. You know, like, you sold me drugs and now you got to take that dirty money and you somehow got to launder it and you got to clean it. But what we really see now is much of the financial means that flow through Canada don't have a precursor crime per se, or the precursor crime isn't in Canada. So, and this is part of the challenge with the way we frame the space in Canada, because much of our legislation is still premised on you need a precursor crime. And if there's no precursor crime, then it makes it much more difficult, for instance, for authorities to do something about those illicit gains. So it's really kind of, by financial crime, we're trying to capture broadly the illicit flows, not just generated within Canada, but that are flowing into Canada and that are flowing through Canada. And when you add up those illicit and economic flows, you're looking at over $100 billion a year, which is enormous for an economy of a relatively modest size such as Canada's.
Yeah, that's a striking number. So should we be thinking about this as a national security threat?
It is one of the most significant national security challenges that we face, because, as you know, money makes the world go round. And so if we don't have money to finance everything from, if you think about sort of the little person who travels abroad, the foreign terrorist fighter that needs a couple of $1,000s to get themselves an airline ticket, your local embassy that engages in foreign interference and the $250,000 that they sort of hand out in cash, to the 3 Mexican cartels that have set up shop in Canada, in part accelerated by some of the visa policy decisions that the federal government had made previously, that are now not only laundering money through this country, but that are actively producing, have shifted production to Canada. Canada now being the major exporter of fentanyl to Australia and also to Europe, and in particular the European Union, because it's easier to do this when you're inside the fence. You might imagine if you're shipping stuff from Mexico, people are going to pay much closer attention than if you're shipping stuff from sort of within the trusted economic region. And of course, we've become a haven for folks that are engaging in various forms of state capture. So the illicit outflows from a country such as China are estimated at about $50 billion US a year. And I mean, China is sort of perhaps the most egregious example, but of course there's plenty of kleptocrats and thugs around the world that have become very happy to park their illicit gains here in Canada because it's a relatively safe place to put your money. We've got a nice sort of stable rule of law and financial system. And for instance, the Common Commission on Money Laundering in British Columbia has estimated that about 8% of housing costs, an increase in housing costs in Vancouver, is driven by those offshore financial gains. We're the only country where we've actually had a term coined for that. So the laundering of cash through Vancouver casinos, the Vancouver method, John Longdale from Macquarie that coined that term, and then more broadly, snow shoring and snow washing. So bringing your funds into Canada and either parking them here or moving them here to other jurisdictions such as the Caribbean and elsewhere.
Christian, how's it gotten to this? Because, over the years we've had FinTrack. I mean, we've been very active, as you point out, in the book, on the international stage, part of some of the institutions that have been designed to deal with money laundering. How is it that we've gotten to this point where there is this very specific language, for Canada as a problem? I mean, I would assume anywhere that there's criminal markets, you have the need to launder the profits. What has happened that's put us in a position where we're starting to be seen, I think, as a bit of a weak link in the international financial system? Let's
start with the tactical piece, the FinTrack piece. So FinTrack in some ways is sort of an afterthought that comes into being after 9/11, the terrorist attacks of 2001, where there's sort of a recognition that countries need to get a better handle on financial intelligence that's driving sort of illicit, clearly sort of violence and illicit bad behavior that clearly runs counter to our interests, and that money is sort of a significant component behind that. Also a recognition that financial crime may well be the most complex crime to investigate in the world, so we actually needed to stand up separate intelligence agencies to do this. So I think that's an interesting recognition. But in Canada, we made a curious decision. FinTrack does not look like any other FIU in the Western democratic world. So we have what is largely an administrative agency, which has relatively few enforcement powers. And so this is why you see FinTrack, as of late, having been very proud to levy fines against banks in the millions of dollars. That's, of course, after more than 20 years in existence, where before that we got relatively little. Whereas you get in countries such as Australia, fines against casinos by AUSTRAC in the order of $450 million, and against Westpac and CommBank at 1.4 billion Australian dollars and 700 million Australian dollars. As I've joked, in Australia, the Australian banks should maybe move their headquarters to Canada because they would fare much better in terms of their fines. I think the broader challenge in particular for Canada is, so we've known that, so this has been a challenge since the 1980s. And so we've known about some of the convergence of Chinese triads and bad foreign actors in the Canadian space since the 1980s. This is all open source. It's not a state secret, but it was, I think, supercharged by three types of developments. One, if you and I are old enough that we remember in the 1990s and the Chrétien government with its Pacific Rim strategy. And so we opened up our economy to the Indo-Pacific region, which at the time, wasn't quite as, shall we say democratic and rule of law, as it is now. And of course, these are still sort of in many countries sort of developing aspects. And so we welcomed all that money. But as Sana Ahmed, for instance, points out in our book, if you want to immigrate to Canada, or you want to come here in any one way or another, we're going to ask you lots of questions. But if you want to bring your money here, we're not going to ask you anything. We're happy to take your money. And this is partially why politicians like it. They don't really have to work for that money. And it shows up in their jurisdictions, creates jobs, builds buildings, whatever else it might be. So the Pacific Rim strategy in the 1990s, without sort of anticipating that there's a lot of bad actors in the region, both on the state capture side and on the organized crime side, that will be, that free trade doesn't just work for the good guys, it also works for the bad guys. And in many cases, they are guys. So I'm not being sexist sort of here in my in the way I frame this. The two other elements that we got in the late 1990s, early 2000s is, on the one hand, so globalization and free trade that really supercharged this at a global scale.
Yes.
Financial economic crime. And on the other hand, the development of internet and technology. And so we've seen this, the ease with which we can transfer goods, money, and value. But the way we also now see, for instance, cryptocurrency playing a significant role, NFTs, non-fungible tokens. It's estimated that 99% of transactions related to NFTs are bad and illicit behavior, and decentralized finance that is just emerging on the horizon, that I think will fundamentally change not just the banking system in the next 5 years, but that will further supercharge illicit flows. And so we need to play a couple of steps ahead, and where we are is barely inadequate for where we should have been 10 years ago.
You mentioned a couple of jurisdictions doing well. Is there either any of those that you want to draw some particular attention to? Well,
part of this related is to national interest, right? So we saw particularly, the United States through the U.S. Treasury runs an office called OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Controls. If you want to have fun on a Friday afternoon, you can look on their website, because
they have some great graphics.
On Fridays, they always announce who's been sanctioned. And so under the previous Trump administration, one of the jokes was OFAC Fridays, because everybody would go and look who the Trump administration sanctioned that week. So the United States obviously has global geostrategic interests and has very significantly leveraged the disproportionate, people, you remember in the 1990s, sort of the world was flat sort of thesis. Well, it turns out the world, of course, is not flat. That was always a silly thing to say, because it turns out that there are very high mountains. And when it comes, for instance, to financial flows, there's huge convergence of these flows in the United States. 22% of international financial flows at one point or another run, for instance, through New York City alone. And so that gives the United States significant clout over those types of flows. And so the US has increasingly leveraged those as sort of a quasi sort of response to bad actors, hybrid warfare, and so forth. So, but even then, the United States has these are very challenging investigations, and but the U.S. also has a more, I think, sensible system. There's a mechanism in the U.S. where financial institutions are encouraged to report proactively when they find bad transaction in their system, which is a way of avoiding fines. But I should also say, we don't just want to lay all the blame at the foot of banks, because only about 10% of these illicit transactions actually flow through financial institutions. So simply focusing on trying to change the regulatory system or so for banks is probably not going to get you very much. We have a very expensive regulatory system as it is.
Can I pursue you a little bit on that? Because I think one of the fascinating parts of this, you spoke about the digitization, about the role of crypto and NTFs and other things, NFTs, apology. So at the end of the day, criminal transactions are frequently still in hard currency at their start point, in terms of whether it's drugs, et cetera. So you end up with a lot of hard currency. What are the weak points here in terms of how that money is being digitized and put into the legitimate banking system? Have there been advances in how criminal organizations can deal with that particular challenge? You think of movies and TV shows, about Colombian drug barons, with fields of money buried in the backyard. Is that still a relevant way to think about this?
Yeah. So yes and no. So it's an important, I think, point to raise. If you look at, for instance, the recent AI-generated heist in Hong Kong. All avatars at $30 million. So there was no cash that changed hands. If you look at the North Koreans engaging in significant sort of ransomware attacks as a major fundraiser, and now having shifted to simply stealing crypto wallets. So they stole over $1 billion worth in crypto wallets last year. Again, no hard cash sort of changes hands per se. But the cash is still a significant component. We have, for instance, the I'm not sure about the numbers, but at one point we had the highest concentration of high-value cars in the world in Vancouver. We have no regulations in this. You can walk in and purchase the house across the street for $10 million with cash in your suitcase. No requirements for you to explain where that money came from. Right. So those things sort of still that still happens. And, we enable it, right? So we have, when was the last time you or I used a $100 or a $50 bill? Right? My argument is just even some of these simple things that we can do to take bills out of regulation that essentially just cut the costs for people who are moving cash by making it sort of much easier to move these large transactions. But I'd say much of this is the problem is that even within our FIUs, and even if we could get FinTrack, we've got a great intelligence agency that's not particularly good at sharing the intelligence that it has, so we can actually get effective enforcement action. Even if we could get that up to par, the problem is that money laundering as a business, these are professionals, and so they structure transactions in a way that within your sovereign jurisdiction, the transactions actually look perfectly legal. The only way you can actually then figure out that there's something fishy going on is if you track these across different international jurisdictions. The problem is, of course, by and large, FIUs and other law enforcement intelligence agencies don't have the mandate to track across jurisdictions, so you just hire some high-priced lawyers and some high-priced accounting firms, there's one law firm in New York, for instance, that's notorious for taking on all the bad actors and structuring their transactions. They're surprisingly explicit about what they do. That's, I think, what made it really, it's create this sort of vast asymmetry in this quasi-financial warfare, if you want, where the bad actors basically show up with quasi-hypersonic missiles of financial crime, and our law enforcement and intelligence agencies are showing up with a sidearm and trying to stop this hypersonic missile, and we're wondering why the system isn't working particularly well. It could work. I think there are ways to, in the United States, also in Germany, countries that have had a bit more success on this. I think dedicated resources, dedicated agencies, with dedicated expertise on financial crime. When we had the Integrated Proceeds of Crime team that Gary Clement ran in the late 1990s for the RCMP, it was actually quite effective. In the Cowen Commission, we have a long section where we explain how you can structure this type of entity. The top recommendation of the Cowen Commission was essentially a quasi-czar to coordinate on financial crime, on money laundering, and a recommendation that the provincial government in British Columbia to this day has not adopted. It's only adopted 3 out of the over 100 recommendations, so you can see politicians are reticent. What we can take away of this, it's a matter of political will. What politicians want to do and what politicians don't want to do. I think they don't see votes and doing much about it. I think they see the benefits of the illicit flows, and so they don't want to make those benefits too apparent because it drives prosperity, although now, of course, it also drives costs of living, public safety, housing crises, fentanyl crises, and so forth. But my sense is that where there is political will, we do see some action on this, and the difference in Canada has been there's been very little will, and the little bit of will that there has been very slow to translate. But look, Ottawa Convoy, if you remember back to the convoy, the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, who owns that file, all of a sudden when the government realized that some of the electronic illicit flows, you remember sort of the some of the crowdfunding that all of a sudden the government realized was running counter its interests. Within a month, we got the law changed, and we got the remit for FinTrack changed. So when politicians want to do something, it's entirely possible to do something. So this
a recurring theme on national security and law enforcement, I think, in this country, defense is political will is where policy change and action starts. If you had to choose one thing, 2 things maybe to do domestically, 1 to 2 things that Canada should be doing internationally to help fight this problem, what would they be?
Well, I think beneficial ownership is a major challenge.
Well, what's beneficial ownership?
So until very recently in Canada, you could have a numbered company. You could use that numbered company to buy any assets that you would like, but there was no requirement for you to identify yourself as the beneficial owner of those assets through that numbered company. So it meant any crook from around the world could very easily set up shop here and engage in illicit business, and we had no legal mechanisms of identifying these folks. So the government recently changed the law. I think the government, so this is a very significant step forward. The problem is the threshold to register is very high, in my view, far too high. The other problem is that 90% of corporations in this country fall under provincial jurisdiction.
Okay.
So we're only capturing a very small portion with the changes that we've made. Another area where we could make significant differences is if we held the professions to account. The Cullen Commission made that very clear that...
Talking about accountants and lawyers here?
Accountants, lawyers, real estate agents,
okay.
That we need to see action by the professions to police themselves against bad actors that are clearly breaking their professional ethics and doing it systematically. We saw one enforcement action like that by the United States in a case with a Swiss bank, where part of the deal, instead of just paying a fine, was that the 7 senior executives that were involved in that particular scheme effectively for 7 years had to surrender their professional licenses. And why does that matter? Because now you can't earn a living as a lawyer or an accountant. So I think that's a key area where we could be a better player. And the third would be internationally. Look, there's something called the Financial Action Task Force that's sort of meant to set the global standards when it comes to regulation and in this field. And Canada has been a laggard on the FATF standards, and Canada is likely going to get serious reprimand in the next country evaluation by FATF. But the problem is FATF, this is the absolute bottom standard that you absolutely have to meet if you're a Western advanced democracy with a functional rule of law and financial system.
It's a floor, not a ceiling.
So for us to fall short of the floor is an absolute embarrassment, and that at least we can try to keep up with our peer countries. The problem is, of course,
whose company are we keeping, for instance, by being below the floor?
Well, we're competing with Australia for a race to the bottom in terms of some of the Western countries here. And of course, Australia has equally outsized problems, as we know, well documented sort of in public. But Australia has realized that these are now running counter to Australia's geostrategic interests because it's driving national security issues and geostrategic instability. This is part of the reason why Australia is now the Commonwealth government has initiated a major review. They're likely going to do something about the professions, some of what's known as Tranche 2, without sort of going into the details on that. But really, Canada, for a G7 country, a self-respecting G7 country, a country that is a major founder of the international rules-based political order that the foreign minister likes to talk about, well, the major piece that's undermining that rules-based international order is financial and transnational financial and economic crime. And so at least us doing our part to at least live up to the commitments that we've made as part of FATF, I can understand why governments are reticent to do that. It reduces the competitiveness of the financial system. When you've already somewhat mismanaged the economy, you don't want to do things that'll further reduce your economic growth. But certainly, the situation that we currently find ourselves in, as I like to say, the good thing about Canada is we're not entirely useless. We can always serve as a bad example.
I think that's probably a pretty good note maybe to finish this conversation on. Do you have any final thoughts about this issue and what our listeners and viewers should keep in mind when it comes to holding their politicians to account for this issue?
That ultimately we need to make this an election issue, right? That politicians respond to expectations by the electorate. And if politicians understand that one of the ways that we can improve the public safety in this country, one of the ways we can reduce the accelerator in the cost of living in this country is by not handing over so much of our real estate to bad actors internationally. I mean, Gaddafi's apartment in Toronto is just, that literature from the Globe has written about repeatedly, is just one such example. Then maybe we could actually get some accountability and some action from our federal politicians. So I think Canadians should demand more more. And I think much of the allocation that we have on social services and on public safety, even on national security, we could be saving ourselves significant amounts of money and efforts if we got a handle on the vast transnational financial and economic illicit flows that originate in this country, flow through this country, and flow into this country.
Thank you so much. Well, Christian's co-authored book, Dirty Money, Financial Crime in Canada, is one way to get a better sense of how to push the politicians on this issue. So I encourage you to take a look. Christian, thanks so much for joining us today and providing us with all these insights on this issue that hopefully you are certainly working very hard to bring it into more prominence in the public discussion. Again, I'd like to thank you for joining Inside Policy Talks today. There'll be more on national security priorities coming in the weeks ahead. I'm Alex Dalziel. Thanks so much. Until next time.